Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Shayok and welcome back to a brand new video after a very long time. So in this video, I'll be explaining to you what is exposure triangle in photography. So for all those who are currently pursuing journalism, whether it's UG or PG, and if you have any subject called photography, so you must have come across this term called exposure triangle. So now many of you might be wondering that what exposure triangle actually means. So in this video, I will give you a brief idea of what exposure triangle actually means. So let's get started. So what is exposure triangle? So it is basically a term that we use in photography, okay? So which basically shows the relationship between ISO, aperture and shutter speed. Look, in photography, the most important thing is that we use visuals for the purpose of storytelling. So, in case if we are not sure how we should take a photograph when we are having a camera in our hand, then we won't be able to master the art of storytelling. So that means without knowing exposure triangle, we actually cannot learn the art of photography, because we all know that without light we cannot form any visuals. So indirectly in photography, light is very important, and this exposure triangle only guides us to understand how we can control and adjust light when we are in various situations that entails us to adjust the light so that we can click very beautiful pictures. Now in this slide you can actually see the relationship between ISO, shutter speed and aperture in a triangle. That is the exposure triangle. So now if you carefully observe this figure, you can see there are certain numerical figures written under ISO, under shutter speed and above aperture. So what are those things? So we will explain one by one in detail. Okay, so let's start with ISO. So what is ISO? If you have ever used a camera, you must have come across this three letter word ISO. So ISO is nothing but basically the intensity of light that hits the sensor of our camera. It's pretty self-explanatory. Whenever you're clicking any pictures, the light which is illuminating the object is entering in the lens and from the lens to the sensor. So with ISO we can actually adjust the intensity of light that is entering in our camera, which means when we are keeping a high ISO, that means the image is very much overexposed, whereas when we are keeping the ISO less, that means we are basically making the picture look dark. So if I ask you to take a picture of say for example of a pot in a low ISO, in that case what you need to do is you just need to bring down the ISO to 100. In most cameras 100 is basically the lowest range of ISO. So if you click that picture with a low ISO of 100, then you will get a very dark image or underexposed image. Now if I say that you have to take this picture with a higher ISO, in that case what you need to do, you just have to increase the ISO to 1000, 1600 as per the convenience. Now when should we use this type of ISO? We can only use ISO 100 when we have to take any pictures which is highly illuminated, whereas we can take pictures of greater ISO in situations where the light is low. However, we also need to keep this thing in mind that if we take pictures with a greater ISO, then we are actually making our pictures look very grainy, because greater ISO means that more amount of light is entering, and since most of the images that we take are basically pixelated, so light is basically illuminating those pixels. That's the reason why greater ISO can make pictures appear very grainy and pixelated if you zoom it and observe it very carefully. So in that case, what needs to be done? That question that pops up in your mind is what needs to be done. So we have other two elements as well, that is shutter speed and aperture. Now shutter speed. It refers to the amount of time the sensor of your camera is exposed to light, or the speed at which the shutter of your camera closes. Like shutter basically means it's a curtain that is located in front of the lens of the camera. So whenever you're clicking something, the moment you press the button, the button is a shutter button, this curtain closes down. And if we keep a very high shutter speed, that means obviously the speed of the curtain will be very much high. That means less amount of light will enter, and with this we will get a very dark image. However, if we keep the shutter speed very less, that means we are basically allowing the light to enter inside our sensor for a greater amount of time, and because of that we are achieving bright images. So for low shutter speed, the best shutter speed can be 1/100. We can also call this as low shutter speed or slow shutter. Whereas for high shutter speed, we can use like values like 1/1000, 1/2000, etc. And high shutter speed can also be called as fast shutter speed. Now remember one thing, if you are taking pictures with a high shutter speed, then remember your image will actually be very sharp and very crystal clear, which is just the opposite for the case of lower shutter speed. So high shutter speed is usually very helpful when you are clicking pictures, say for example of sunrise and sunset, where you want to show to your audience the clarity of the sun while it's rising and while it's setting down. And for lower shutter speed, you can use this to take pictures of say a running stream or a waterfalls, where you can actually make the image look very blur, just to make the picture look very natural. So I hope this is clear. Now after shutter speed, we have aperture. So what aperture actually means? It basically refers to the amount of light that enters through the opening of the lens. So it's basically like our eye. In our eye, we have something called pupil. So the moment somebody throws a very bright light onto our pupil, what it does, it automatically shrinks. Similarly, in camera also we have this system where we can basically adjust the opening of the lens so that we can allow the required amount of light to enter. If we have to take images which is very much illuminated, for that we basically have to lower down the aperture. And if we have to take images which are very dark, in that case we have to increase the aperture. So it's mentioned if a greater aperture is bright image and lower aperture is dark image. Now remember one thing, small aperture doesn't mean that the figure has to be 1.4. You have to think in terms of light, how much light is entering. Small aperture means lower amount of light is entering. In that case, the number will be f/16. Just imagine in this way. Greater number would mean less amount of light, and smaller number will be more amount of light. So this is what aperture is all about. In the next video, we will be discussing the concept of depth of field, which is also a very important thing to discuss with aperture. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have any queries, you are free to write down under the comment section. And if you have any doubts with the explanation, do share with me. I will try my best to improve in the coming videos. So take care for now. Goodbye.